Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today, as always. Today is Thursday, November 8th, 2 days after the election, so we'll be spending a little bit of time today sort of rehashing what happened and trying to make sense of it all, if we can. With me today to assist us in that endeavor are Greg Sukiennik. He is the Vermont managing editor of the Manchester Journal, Bennington Banner, and Brattleboro Reformer. And Greg, I think you want to introduce our other guest.
I have another introduction to make. Sitting to my right, the brand new editor of the Manchester Journal, Darren Marcy.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to be here.
Darren, welcome.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, Darren.
Well, I'm a 22-year journalist. Spent 22 years in newspapers exclusively, 9 years with the Rutland Herald. The rest of my time, most of it was in New Mexico. I spent 4 years out of journalism. I'm still in the writing, editing industry, but out of daily journalism, weekly journalism. And I've come back because the New England newspapers, they're doing it right here, and I want to be part of that. So.
We're glad to have him aboard. It's good to be adding a veteran journalist back to the mix as we continue to try to grow what we're doing.
Okay, well, Darren, welcome to the neighborhood.
Thank you. Glad to
have you with us. As I said there at the top, we had a little bit of an election there on Tuesday, a couple of days ago. Some surprising results, I guess, is my initial reaction to it, but interested to hear what you guys made of it. Obviously, the big story, I guess, for our area is the Bennington 4 race, the Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, Sunderland district there, that a two-member district represented up to Tuesday, well, still is, I guess, until January, by Brian Keefe, a Republican, and Cynthia Browning, a Democrat. Cynthia's been in there for, I think, 7 terms. I think this will be her 8th term now. Brian won election in 2016, was serving his first term, and came out in third place in that field, which was kind of interesting. Kathleen James, the first-time candidate, was the overall winner, garnering, I think, by the numbers I pulled together here, almost 2,130 votes. Cynthia coming in second place with about 1,938, and Brian at 1,731. So what do you think explains that outcome? Well,
have you got half an hour?
Well, we do.
In fact, there's a few things come to mind. First, I think Kathleen ran a really energetic campaign. She had a ground game. She had some direct mail. She had a lot of enthusiasm behind her. And when someone comes into a race with that much energy and enthusiasm, that's something that that has an impact on the rest of the race. Second, I think it's Phil Scott, the only Republican statewide winner in Vermont, so that's sort of not really a great year for Republicans in the area, and we'll get to some of that in a little bit. And it might have simply been that folks in the area didn't have anyone else to vote against. Brian really didn't. He was only a first-time incumbent. He had some bills passed. He said he didn't really felt like he did anything to merit himself getting sent home, and I would agree with that assessment. So it just very well might have been that he got caught up in a year where having an R next to your name was a liability. I mean, there's some other Republicans across the state in the House who lost races, incumbents who were sent home. Kurt Wright in Burlington, for example, despite the fact that he had the Democratic mayor endorsing him. Heidi Sherman in Stowe nearly lost to a first-time challenger. So he very well just might have been caught up in that. And then you have, Cynthia has her base in Arlington and Sunderland and Sandgate, and she did well in her hometown and did well enough elsewhere to come in second.
Yeah. So the blue wave then, I guess, explains part of it then, we figure.
I think that really has something to do with it. I mean, it's they say all politics is local, but when we've got the national situation that we've had going on for the past 2 years, there's a lot of anger out there. And I think some of that came home to Vermont. Obviously, Kathleen James leans a little to the left of the other two candidates, and I think there was a lot of energy in that side of the discussion. I don't know that the Brian Keefe is necessarily an extreme right. I think he's much more of a Vermont Republican, otherwise known as a Democrat in other places in the country. But he acquitted himself well. He just, like Greg said, he might just have been guilty of being a Republican in 2018. That might have been part of it.
We've seen this before. I think. I didn't personally see it before, but I understand it was in 2008 that Jody Livingston was the Republican representative from Manchester, and lost to Jeff Wilson.
Very close election too. I think
And
there was 5 or 6 votes.
Very close election. And again, from what I've been told, did by most accounts did a fine job as state rep for Manchester. Didn't do anything to get sent home, but it was very much a Democrat year. There was a lot of anger about the Bush administration and a lot of energy on the Democrat side, and sometimes that's what happens.
Yeah, well, that seems to be certainly one factor here in play. But as you say, Kathleen certainly had a very energetic campaign going
That's for
on
sure.
out there. A lot of visibility on social media and a lot of sign waves, a lot of lawn signs, all of the basic nuts and bolts, knocking on doors, kind of stuff.
And Cynthia stepped up as well as a candidate. Just, I think she's more in tune with the actual mechanics of being a state rep and governing rather than sort of the political part of it. But there was, there was some more energy out of her candidacy, late, and I think that helped her out.
Well, it's going to be interesting as we look at the statewide picture and how some of this plays into that. Like you say, this was kind of not an anomaly. We saw elsewhere around the state Republican incumbents losing seats, and now the big story of the evening, I guess, is that the Democrats now have enough of a majority, a supermajority, to override gubernatorial vetoes. And as we know, that veto tool was a favorite tool of Governor Scott in his attempts to make good on his campaign promise to bring affordability back to the state and no more new taxes and fees and all of that kind of thing. He did wield that veto pen, I think, 11 times over the last 2 years.
Tied Howard Dean for most used.
It's been a while since we've seen that much activity there. So that arrow is now out of the quiver. And of course, some of the commentary we've been seeing is that, well, that means that they're going to have to sort of work with the legislature a little bit more better than they did the first two years when major policy proposals would surface in the second half of the session. I guess I wonder. Do you think the fact that the Democrats now, in combination with 7 progressives, I think that would give them 100 votes. Does that place someone like Cynthia Browning, who's a tax policy wonk by her own description, in an even more powerful position than she might have been?
I think that's exactly right. Cynthia and other folks who are middle ground type Democrats are going to have a lot of power, I think, in Montpelier. Now, even with 100 votes, the people still want to see the government work, and they can't just go in and start enforcing their will, and they really need to govern still. It's obviously going to bring Governor Scott down to maybe talk to folks a little bit earlier in the process. I don't think you're going to be able to sit up in his office and wait for the Democrats to put a bill on the table and then nix it like he did last year. He's going to need to come down and be part of the process and get his staff involved early and help craft bills rather than just vetoing them once they show up.
And the interesting thing about that is when Phil Scott first ran in 2016, he talked about his experience as a state senator and about being a minority in an overwhelmingly Democrat progressive state Senate and how he could reach across the aisle. And some have said we haven't seen as much of that as we thought we might see in his first 2 years. But I think perhaps now we might see more of that, and we'll really get a sense of what he can do along those lines. I mean, also, it's 2 years isn't a lot of time to get something done as a governor, and a second 2-year term, I think with that hurdle is going to tell us a lot more about what we really have in Phil Scott.
Yeah, well, he came into office widely regarded as a sort of a reaching out across the aisle, friendly guy, nice guy, got along well with everybody, pragmatist, sensible kind of approach to things. And then we saw this other kind of harder edge emerge, like you said. So, yeah, It'll
I mean,
be,
not jagged.
No,
I mean, that means certainly, not to the,
No, not-
hardline right winger in any sense of the
Oh, no,
imagination.
but it's somewhat, just a different tone, I guess.
Yeah.
As lieutenant governor, he was a jovial stock car driving. Everybody liked him. He ran around the state to great acclaim, and people were big fans of Phil Scott. And as governor, there was more of an edge to him.
And it's also a different job, too.
Yeah,
Let's face
it's a
it.
much different job.
The buck stops with the governor, right? The lieutenant governor can sort of, go off and do, cut ribbons and do all the fun stuff or
Sure.
whatever. And
There might have been some staff involved in some of this too. There's, talk about his staff not being quite as eager to work with legislators.
We'll see.
So, and just real quickly,
Did well in Manchester. Yeah.
Christine Hallquist, before we move on from that, carried Bennington,
Yes.
the town of, by not by much, about a dozen or so votes or so, but it was the one town in Bennington County that she carried, and one of the few towns in over in Windham County, she carried quite
She
a
did
few.
very well in Windham County. I looked at some of the numbers, just sort of in the area where the GNAT serves. I mean, Phil did 52% in Manchester, 57% in Dorset, 50% in Arlington. The interesting thing about that is then you look at the lieutenant governor numbers, and sort of points to sort of the Republicans' statewide problem and this is the candidate who probably was the best funded and ran the best overall campaign among the down ticket races in Don Turner against Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman. Manchester, Zuckerman won 56%, 60% in Dorset, 57% in Arlington. So it really sort of points to Phil Scott's personality and people's impression of him, I think, and satisfaction with the job that he's done so far. But you look at that swing in the numbers of the lieutenant governor's race, and you see that there's still that this is still a blue state, and that there are still hurdles for Phil to maneuver if he's going to get his agenda through.
All right. Well, I guess we'll see proposals for the minimum wage and family leave and tax and regulate marijuana.
I think we can bet on those.
Carbon tax too, perhaps, kind of an issue that bubbled up as well. So we'll all stay tuned on that. Elsewhere around the county, I think there were two other races that were competitive. I guess the state's attorney race and the county sheriff's race. County Sheriff Chad Schmidt, as it turns out, won re-election by a pretty substantial margin. I think, if I remember correctly, about roughly twice as many votes as his nearest challenger, James Gully Jr., who also lost to him in the primary but came back and ran as an independent. I guess the other race that is kind of interesting was that state's attorney race, which got kind of intriguing when Arnold Gottlieb, who challenged Erica Marthage, the incumbent in the primary, lost and then kind of seemed to be suspending his campaign, even though he was remaining on the ballot as an independent. And along comes Christina Rainville, a former deputy, to challenge Marthage in the general election, and then enough supporters kind of prevailed on Arnold to maybe say, hey, if elected, I will serve, or something like that.
The reverse Pat Paulson.
That probably wasn't great news for Christina Rainville when he sort of resurfaced.
That might not have been really helpful for her, but at the same time, his supporters and the platform he was running on were more in line. They're much more different than either Rainville or Marthage. I mean, Rainville and Marthage being a little more similar in their approach to criminal justice. Gottlieb being a little more reformer, if you will. I wonder what would have happened if he had stayed in the race as an independent. I wonder if we would have, if there would have been more of a conversation about drug court, about incarceration rates, about some of the issues that he raised in the primary. That said, Erica Marthage did win by a pretty healthy margin, and
right.
So, it's Bennington County has a history of supporting prosecutors, state's attorneys who are perceived as tough on crime, and it doesn't seem like that's going away anytime soon.
No, clearly, Erica certainly corralled the votes, not just on the primary, but certainly in this general election. She definitely won by a pretty convincing majority. So 4 more years definitely down there, and it'll be interesting to see. That whole business about the higher incarceration rate in Bennington County was kind of bemusing. I mean, there was that 7 Days article that came out a couple of years ago
Right.
that kind of hung that there, and I guess I read another piece where 1% of Bennington County is incarcerated, which is, I guess, the highest county-wide rate anywhere in the state. I'm not so sure, though, that the two things necessarily mean that we have a sort of, super hard on, tough on crime attitude where lock them up and throw away the key is kind of the mindset.
Certainly, there was some questions about the validity of the statistics, and there's some back and forth on that we saw through the campaign. But another thing to sort of keep in mind is that Erica Marthage also is from here in Manchester, and was sort of the hometown candidate, if you will.
Yeah,
and I think
right.
that does carry some that does
Sure.
help you. It certainly doesn't hurt when you're running for re-election.
No, it doesn't.
To have a network of supporters and folks that you went to school with and folks
Right.
who know you very well.
Right.
And having your name in the paper on a regular basis. Name recognition is one of the most critical elements when you're trying to win an election, and having your name in the daily paper throughout the year, that's you're running for office all year long. So it's
It can't hurt.
That's where some would say, look at Christine Hallquist's campaign and say, well, if she'd had better name recognition earlier, that maybe this might have been different. Who knows? That's another one of those unanswerable questions.
Yeah.
other than the folks who were served by that co-op
her
who
utility.
knew her name
Yeah.
before a year ago. So
Right. Right.
And one random, though, I just want to throw out there is I do hope that some of these folks who ran for office actually, don't just go back to what they were doing and stay involved. Because there were certainly Brian, stepping down, having to step down after 2 years. I'd be happy to see him still involved in the process, and perhaps in the administration. Christine Hallquist, someone else who I think made a name for herself and made some history here in Vermont as well. And I think there's a fairly favorable opinion of her. And these are people who've got more to give. So locally and on a statewide level, I'd like to see some folks stick around.
Yeah, I mean, I thought some of Hallquist's ideas were pretty interesting. The internet one in particular was kind of intriguing. I never really saw a good number crunching of that. I mean, she made it sound like this would be the kind of easy way to do it, to have the electrical utilities, use their poles and infrastructure. But I always found myself thinking, well, okay, if it was that easy, why wouldn't we have done that already?
yeah, and internet access is a huge issue, and so it was a winning topic for her. But yeah. I never saw it proved out through the numbers either. I'm not saying that it wasn't possible or she didn't have it sussed out in her numbers, but it was a winning issue. I don't know that she convinced anybody that it was actually possible.
Right.
So.
Well, of course, that was one of the criticisms of her campaign, was that there was a lot of lack of specificity around a lot of these proposals about how much it would actually cost or who was going to wind up paying for it.
You can say the same thing about Phil Scott, though. In terms of being pinned down on specifics.
Right.
And that's an occupational hazard for being a statewide candidate, it seems.
Ideas are easy. It's
Yeah.
you can make a lot of promises when you're on the campaign trail.
Well, we've got a couple more minutes before we have to go.
Chicken in every pot.
One story that we'll just throw out there, it's been discussed before, but it looks like we may have an opportunity to revisit is, as many folks know, the State Board of Education has until the end of this month to produce their long-awaited report on what the final disposition of school districts is going to wind up being under Act 46. Of course, one of the districts, or two of them actually, they're kind of out there waiting to hear what their final decision is going to be, are Arlington and Sandgate, or the Battenkill Valley Supervisory Union. On November 15th, the State Board of Education, is scheduled to meet again, I think up in Barre. And at that point, in theory, we'll find out if the Battenkill Valley Supervisory Union is going to remain in existence or not. And if not, then where do those two school districts go? It's been discussed for a while that, well, they'll probably come to the Bennington Rutland Supervisory Union. But they've been a little bit hesitant about that, saying, hey, we already have our hands full of absorbing the Taconic and Green merger and the Rupert Paulet merger and even the Mountain Towns merger from several years back. Still, it's just been a lot to do, and they'd like to kind of get back to focusing on education for a change instead of administrative governance questions. So, any thoughts on that? Do you think that they're likely to wind up either here, or the alternative being to be merged in with the Southern Vermont Supervisor Union based in Bennington?
I don't have my crystal ball handy, but I know what happened at the BRSU meeting this past Tuesday. They had an emergency meeting on election night, and Superintendent Jackie Wilson had called the meeting. She actually presented a memo to the board saying, look, we can't handle any more districts. We're at capacity. We're doing all we can, and we think we're doing a real good job with what we've got. But any additional responsibilities could crash the union. She literally doesn't think that the union can handle any more responsibility, any more districts. And the board supported her. They didn't really know how best to get that message across, but they knew that they wanted to send that message to the state board for this next meeting on the 15th. What they chose to do is to take a letter that they had written to the state board May 5th, I think it was.
May 15th.
May 15th, okay. And basically edit it a little bit to firm up, take out all of the wishy-washy statements and make sure that the state board understands firmly they don't want any more districts to be assigned to them. At the same time, they want to be good neighbors to Arlington and Sandgate. They say, look, we're going to be working with these groups and helping them anyway because we're neighbors. It's not that we don't want to help you, but we just can't handle it.
Now, they can't handle it now, as in this year or next year, but what about in 3 or 4 years after the dust has settled on some of these other ones?
Yeah, I think they fully expect that it could happen down the road, and they're fine with that. The overall consensus of what I heard, they're saying, look, give us a couple of years, and then once we know what we're doing and once we get everything lined up here, then maybe we can absorb another district. And so I don't think they're totally against it. They just don't want it to happen right now.
Now, two things to sort of follow up on that. The SVSU has its own merger going on potentially, which I think that the State Board of Ed still has to rule on what's going to happen with them.
Right.
And from Arlington and Sandgate's perspective, Arlington's been mentioned as the possible town heading to the SVSU and perhaps Sandgate to the BRSU. Arlington certainly would rather have its own control of its own destiny, which is, the SVSU already runs a high school in Mount Anthony, so there's nothing but what ifs, ahead in the roadmap there for Arlington, which is. That's not a great feeling. So I understand there. It'd be interesting to see what the board decides and how Arlington will react. Especially considering that Arlington's had some really great news lately for its residents and students and faculty to be thinking about.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm segueing for you. Television treks.
Referring to the sports department part.
Yes.
Right. Two simultaneous state soccer championships. That's kind of cool.
It was a big deal in Arlington last Saturday. I drove down to look at the parade or watch the parade and experience the community's reaction. And considering half the town had traveled with the team and was still on the road, when there were still quite a few people on the street lining up waiting for that parade. And they went through, when the buses and the fire trucks rolled through, there was a great deal of excitement. I talked to several people on the street, residents, members of the school, the school board chairwoman, and they all pointed out this is a really big deal for a small town like Arlington. It's a state championship in sports. They understand that there's a limitation to that value, but as far as the quality and the excitement that the sports teams have brought into the community and the pride. I mean, your local school wins the state title, you puff your chest up a little bit and you look at yourself a little better. And it's hard to be in a small town Vermont these days in many ways, and this is one of the great shining positive things that they can look forward to now.
Yeah, well, I can't remember a time when you had a double championship, both the boys and girls soccer team
1990,
winning
I think.
the same day, I guess.
Yeah, the same day at the same field. Certainly, being a community newspaper editor, that's one of those fun days.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes the news isn't nearly as fun. You know, sometimes it's lots of detail. Sometimes it's bad news. That's harder to cover because you're human. This was one of those stories that it was kind of a gift that kept on giving. And when you think about Arlington's identity, you know, we get sort of coming back around to, you know, the future of the high school. I mean, the high school is so much a part of Arlington's identity, and they clearly do appreciate the history of it. Just walking in, seeing all the photos of, you know, champions past from baseball teams from the 20s forward, you know, so that was a fun afternoon.
Yeah, it was.
And I'll be heading up to Rutland on Saturday to see if the Burton football team can add to the local championship score. And
Wow.
that's the sports report.
That would be, are they favored? Or are they,
They've been favored all year, so they're playing the defending champions in Fairhaven. They've beat Fairhaven already once this year.
Handily.
But it's high school sports, yeah, and it's football, so there's all kinds of variables.
strange bounces?
You never know. The oblong spheroid does take funny bounces. So
They're 9-1. I think they've been to the state title game 3 of the last 4 years. Is this a rematch of last year's?
no,
Okay.
they
didn't make
lost
it
in the
last year.
semifinal last
Okay.
year, much to their surprise. So I think there's also some redemption for some of these kids who are accustomed to finishing their season at Rutland High School and not in their own field.
I would not be surprised to see the Rutland stands loaded with BBA folks Saturday afternoon.
All right. Well, make your travel plans now then, I guess.
Prepare for the weather, rain and snow, possibly.
Ooh, okay. More? Oh, gosh. All right. Well, I guess we'll have to leave it at that for today. But, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming in and sharing all of that with us. Great to have Greg Sukiennik, the Vermont editor of the Journal, the Banner, and the Reformer. And pleased to welcome Darren Marcy,
Thank you.
The new editor of the Manchester Journal. And I'm sure we'll be seeing you again many times going
Thanks, Andrew.
forward.
This was fun.
And thanks all of you for being with us today. It's been a pleasure to share part of your day, our day with you. And we'll see you again the next time. Thanks again.